They killed us. You got out. The variants. You can't fight them. You have to hide. You can unlock the main doors from security control. You have to get the fuck out of this terrible place. Little pig.
Horror is a finicky thing for me. It's a genre where the enjoyment of it is dependent on my current mood. I don't always watch horror, but it's one of my favorite genres across different medias. In the case of horror gaming, the same thing applies. I generally, for the most part, play shooters primarily. It's what I gravitate towards. But from time to time, I venture out and explore different horizons. And at some point in 2013, survival horror was on the rise thanks to Amnesia: The Dark Descent and many others that had begun to crop up. But in that same year, Red Barrels had released what is probably my favorite modern survival horror game of all time, Outlast. Outlast is one of those games where the ability to fight back is taken away from you. Usually I hate this sort of thing, because even in games like Silent Hill and Resident Evil, where the enemies were stronger than you could fight back by managing your resources and learning how to outsmart them. In games like Amnesia, you're never given some way to incapacitate them, or even finding an indirect way to kill them, and I hate it. Outlast is a victim of the same problem, but in this context, even if you could fight back, it would cost you a great deal, and you would probably die in the process. When you look at characters like Chris Walker and Eddie Gluskin, you'd have to ask yourself if a chance to kill them is even worth it. One wants to collect your head, and the other wants to make an honest woman out of you.
Rather die than be with me. Than die. from these idiots. The smell of my love's arbor. Darling, you can't hide it from me. You make yourself a gift for me. A delicacy to be unwrapped and unwrapped again. Okay.
The human element is what ultimately makes this game scarier than most of the other horror games that I've played, and given the fact that pretty much the entire asylum is full of people like the ones I just mentioned, it somewhat makes sense why you do everything in your power to avoid them, rather than finding a way to fight back. Why do I make an exception for Outlast though? Well, the setting is so well realized, the asylum feels both terrifying and interesting to explore, the camera system provides a found footage element to the whole shit show, the soundtrack is both disruptive but intensifying at the same time, and it has some of the most memorable survival horror villains in recent years. The game sets you as a reporter named Miles Upshur, who gets a lead on the Murkoff Corporation, part of a conspiracy to conduct heinous experiments that violate a number of human rights, all within the Mount Massive Asylum, the centerpiece for all the events that take place in this game. Everything gets out of hand very quickly, for you find that the asylum itself has been taken over by the inmates, and the facility is now littered with blood, gore, bile, and feces, and now you can't get out. You meet a few characters that are unhinged in different ways. You have Chris Walker, the big bold dude who constantly stalks you from beginning to end, who has this military persona that drives him as if it's a mission for him to kill you. Father Martin is a priest of sorts who wants you to witness the Walrider, a sort of entity that is running rampant throughout the facility, so to speak, but I won't spoil it. Traeger is an unhinged dude that sounds somewhat normal, like one of those CEOs, or executives that ended up in an asylum.
Oh, movies. And it'll give us a chance to talk. You know, I'm a bit worried how much time you've been spending with Father Martin. I hope you haven't been letting him confuse you with all his holier-than-thou Bible thumping. No offense to the man, but I sometimes worry he might just be a little bit crazy.
And the twins are two naked brothers that just walk and kill you in one hit. They also bounce off of each other's dialogue, like two minds in one brain.
Who's this?
Maybe Father Martin's man.
Maybe.
He looks nervous.
I would like to kill him.
As would I.
The preacher asked us not to.
It would be impolite.
Not here.
We give him a running start.
There's an idea.
And when we kill him slow.
Such patience.
I want his tongue. And liver.
They are yours.
Then you have the rest of the denizens who have been mutilated and violated in all different manners, and no one is stopping them. The staff are dead. The supposed doctor that you end up hearing about is presumed dead. Outlast tells its story through the notes you take and the documents you collect, adding a pretty extensive amount of lore to the world of Outlast, the asylum itself, its inmates, and the experiments that have been undertaken. The main character doesn't talk, but screams or grunts, or shows signs of panic when he's being chased, or when there's a jump scare. You'll learn a bit more about him in his notes that he takes when you witness certain events with the camera on. Speaking of which, the game revolves around the camera. It is your source of light when there is none, using the night vision mode, which has a battery system that depletes once the bar is empty. Depending on the difficulty that you play, you can only carry a certain amount, and God forbid if you play on insane or nightmare mode, you can only pick 2 batteries, which is fucking dumb if you ask me, other than that to make the game arbitrarily harder than it needs to be. But technically, you can beat the game without it. but then you would be missing out on some of the story elements that are connected to the camera, and that's one of the best things about the camera. It's not just your main tool, but it is part of the character's identity and is the way to bring the game's story into the light. And story-wise, it's fairly lightweight and somewhat predictable, but the way it's shown coupled with the documents and notes adds more layers that make Outlast a memorable experience. And Outlast truly is a memorable game. Its characters are full of personality and strike a terrifying presence whenever they're around. Characters like Chris Walker, Richard Traeger, and Eddie Gluskin in the Whistleblower DLC are an extension of the horrors that the Asylum has produced, and Outlast has horror in spades, and the good kind too, where the game isn't always trying to jump scare you, which the game does admittedly have, but the scares are warranted because you're in an asylum that's literally become a madhouse, filled with debauchery and murder. Mechanically, the game feels clean. Running, crouching, hiding in the lockers, under the bed, and climbing over ledges, climbing into vent shafts all correlate with one another. Through exploration and chase sequences, controls feel simple to understand. Your efforts to survive are determined by how you handle yourself under pressure when you're being chased by the likes of Chris and Eddie, characters who can kill you instantly on the highest difficulties like Nightmare or Insane, where you have 2 batteries, you take more damage, and as I said, certain characters can kill you with 1 hit or by grabbing you. Insane difficulty is essentially the same as Nightmare, but with one caveat. If you die at any point in your playthrough, you start back at the beginning. The same applies to the DLC. So for first timers, I'd recommend normal for a fairer experience. I have managed to beat Insane mode on both the main game and the DLC, and this game has some incredibly nail-biting sequences, especially when you're faced with the threat of losing your save after dying. But Outlast is actually a really short game. At the most, it'll take 4 hours, maybe even 3. But if you really know what you're doing, you can beat it in under an hour, and even less with the Whistleblower DLC. To be honest, I'm happy with the duration. It doesn't overstay its welcome. Its violent journey ends not long after it begins. The Asylum makes use of its short time by showing so much of it, from the administration block to the sewers, the prison section, the male and female ward, and the infamous workshop where births take place. With the Whistleblower DLC, you play as Waylon Park, the guy who gave the lead to Miles Upshur. It's set in between the events of Outlast and after it. It has one of the best villains in horror gaming, someone who is unnerving to a higher degree, and the person I'm referring to is Eddie Gluskin himself, also known as the Groom. In the case of Waylon, he is someone that worked for Murkoff but grew a conscience after seeing what was really happening. Unfortunately for him, he was committed to the asylum, and during the efforts of his escape, he meets his husband-to-be, where he almost becomes a woman. Those who have played it will know what I'm talking about. And let's not forget the use of sound here. The sound of footsteps, doors being banged shut, the mutterings and screams of the inmates that run throughout the asylum, on top of the music beats that give off a mix of somber and intensifying notes that play at the right time. All in all, it's really good. It fits the game so well, and has this like haunting but bittersweet kind of tone to the whole affair. Outlast is not a pretty game in terms of the context, but graphically it still holds up okay for an indie horror game, and looks pretty good for 2013 standards. It's a very gory game, and can be pretty disturbing in certain sections, especially with some infamous scenes in the DLC, as well as some scenes in the main game. The ones who have played them both will know what I'm talking about here. If you can't handle extreme levels of gore and violence, I wouldn't recommend this game. But for those who absolutely relish in it, you will find something really nice here. Outlast is just amazing. It has everything going for it that constitutes a great survival horror game. It allowed me to make an exception for my genuine dislike for horror games where you can't fight back in any way, and every time I play it, it always manages to get me in one way or another. The DLC is also just as good, and I would highly recommend playing it right after you beat the main game, but not before. I can't say the same for the sequel, however, which in my opinion is a big disappointment by comparison, but still, the new and upcoming Outlast looks promising, and it seems like it's going back to its roots, where it's like the first Outlast game again, but with a few fundamental differences, that being co-op. If you're looking for an incredible survival horror game, then Outlast is an absolute must-buy. Thank you for watching.
cook.